Hi, Glenn.
Hey Bob, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Doing great. Excited for my maiden blogging heads with the proprietor and founder.
It is a maiden in that sense. Nice dog you got there, by the way. You were on many years ago. I think arguing with Ben Smith, maybe.
I argued with a lot of people on blogging
I'm
heads.
sure
I
they
argued
all
with
blur
Ben
together
Smith
after a
and
while.
Megan McArdle and Anna Marie Cox. It used to be my venue for boxing, so I'm happy to be back.
Yeah. Well, you've gotten more famous, I would say, since you've reached needs no introduction status, I would say. But I think I'll introduce you anyway. You're Glenn Greenwald. I'm
I
Robert
am.
Wright of Blogging Heads TV. This is the Wright Show. You are well known for your getting a Pulitzer Prize for your role in the disclosing the Snowden documents. The document about that, Citizen 4 won the Academy Award. You were up on stage at the Academy Awards. You got a book out, No Place to Hide, about all this stuff, and you write for the Intercept, which is great. And there's a lot of stuff I hope to talk about if we have time. I mean, little civil liberties, little drone strikes. But I wanted to start with something that's going on pretty timely. As it happens, the this organization of writers, gave a somewhat controversial award to Charlie Hebdo at roughly the same time that this Texas shooting happened around the Muhammad cartoon contest near Dallas. And I think you see a connection, these two, as in some way related events. And I think you and I are somewhat on the same side of this argument. My view is that my position is not that, shouldn't even be controversial, and it's fairly simple, but I have a lot of trouble conveying to people what I mean by it. Why don't you start by telling people what your view is on this whole thing?
Sure. So let me just say what my view is not, because the debate has been just so distorted, especially the views of the people who have raised questions or objected to the award. No decent person obviously thinks there's any remote justification for violence against the Charlie Hebdo cartoonist. That should just go without saying. I also find it very frustrating that there's some sort of suggestion that if you object to an award given to Charlie Hebdo cartoonist at a expensive gala in New York, that it somehow means that you're an opponent of free speech or are violating principles of free speech. I've spent my entire career, both as a lawyer and then as a journalist, defending the free speech rights, not including, but especially of the people who have views that I find most repellent. And I've never, ever, ever heard until basically this month anyone suggest that to defend someone's free speech rights, you have to not only oppose incursions into their ability to speak, but also give them awards. It would never have occurred to me to give an award to the white supremacist or anti-immigration extremist whose First Amendment rights I represented. I would have opposed an award for them while at the same time vehemently defending their rights. So it's really not a free speech issue as well. The question is Charlie Hebdo doing the sort of thing that you think merits admiration and being honored? And for me, this is the key distinction. And I'll use an analogy to illustrate it. I am vehemently opposed to the oppression of lesbian and gay citizens in Iran. But I don't make that my cause because I believe that the people who are making it their cause are exploiting that issue for agendas and interests that I don't agree with, namely to demonize the Iranian government in order to gin up hostility towards them and hope to maintain hostility towards them, just like women's rights in Afghanistan were exploited that way, or human rights in Iraq were. So of course, I am vehemently opposed to the idea that a cartoonist will be slaughtered in their office for a cartoon that they publish. But I think the reason this has become such a huge cause célèbre in the West, where pretty much everybody has decided to make Charlie Hebdo cartoonists their martyrs, is because it bolsters this narrative that I find quite objectionable and dangerous and destructive, that we in the West are the advanced, progressive, enlightened victims of violence, and there's this primitive, marauding horde of dangerous threats called Muslims or radical Islam or whatever. This is the narrative that has driven the American War on Terror and the Western assault on large parts of the Western world. And that, I believe, is the reason that so many people who don't seem to really care about free expression in most other cases when it's being violated have decided to embrace this particular instance. And I think that's where most of the objection is coming from.
Okay. Now, the first thing people say when you, a few minutes ago, you said, I wouldn't embrace the speech of white supremacists, even though I would defend their right to speak. And that seems to me like a reasonably clear distinction. In this case, what people right away say is, but wait a second, Charlie Hebdo is different from the white supremacists. This is satire. And, I saw a lot of this on Twitter. And, of course, one frustration about Twitter is the 140 character limit. And I just find it almost hopeless to argue these points on Twitter. You are more courageous in that sense. You argue,
or more stupid, I think, is probably
it's working.
Accurate.
It's working for you. You have more followers than I do by at least an order of magnitude. But what do you say to that? I mean, what misconception does it reflect in your view when people say, "But wait a second, these are actual artists at work. This is satire. Satire has a hallowed place in the history of the world."
So, I mean, a few things. And, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is a really hard issue to debate because the emotions are so high because, like, what reward or payoff is there in arguing against an award being given to, French cartoonists who were slaughtered in their office? I mean, it provokes all sorts of emotions. And not only have I tried unsuccessfully to avoid discussing it on Twitter, but I've actually turned down every cable news show where I'm supposed to go and be the anti-Charlie Hebdo person because you can't make the case in that kind of a format. And that's actually why I was excited to talk to you because this is a real discussion. And it's a hard case to make, especially for those on this side. So I would say a few things. Number one is, when this whole Charlie Hebdo thing first happened, and then when the PEN Award was announced and the controversy ensued, the argument was that the reason Charlie Hebdo deserves to be honored and rewarded, you don't have to agree with the content of their speech. It's just that what they did is courageous in and of itself because they continue to express these viewpoints even in the face of credible threats. And I do think that's true. There's no question Charlie Hebdo cartoonists were courageous. But that certainly doesn't end the debate. I mean, lots of people do think something courageously that doesn't merit admiration. I mean, Pam Geller, whatever else you want to say about her, going around holding a Draw Muhammad cartoon contest is courageous in exactly the sense that it was courageous for Charlie Hebdo to do what they did, and yet most people who are in favor of the award to Charlie Hebdo would never be seen dead advocating an award for Pam Geller. The 9/11 hijackers, whatever else you want to say about them, were courageous, right? That's what Bill Maher got fired for saying, just because it was too true too soon. But to get in an airplane and fly it into a building in pursuit of a political ideal, whatever else it is, evil, all those things, it too is courageous. And you can think of lots of different examples of speech that would be designed to provoke, where we would want to defend the right of the people to do it, but where we wouldn't find it admirable. You could go into the middle of a biker bar wearing a, Harley Davidson are for fags t-shirt, or you can go into, Compton in Los Angeles, wearing some racist t-shirt or onto an Israeli settlement, wearing a big picture of Adolf Hitler with Mein Kampf quotes. Those are all speech that's designed to provoke and that likely could provoke violence, but we wouldn't regard it as admirable to do, even if we think the violence is unjustified. So then you get to the question, in order to defend Charlie Hebdo, it's not enough to say they were courageous. Lots of people do courageous things and don't deserve awards. The question has to be, do you believe the cause that they were pursuing is one that is worthwhile and justifiable? And here I think a critical distinction is necessary. You have the reality of Charlie Hebdo and who they are and what they did, but then on the other hand, you have the kind of iconic image of Charlie Hebdo that has been created in the West, the one that's being seized upon and used and held up, and that most people in the West for the first time learned about when they heard Charlie Hebdo. And those might be two different things. You can think Charlie Hebdo are these leftists who are just, doing equal opportunity blasphemy and like that, but they became known in the West and are beloved in the West because of their anti-Muslim cartoons and the way those cartoons provoke violence by radical Muslims. And what I find just, I guess, troubling about that is the way that it just seems like this is being seized upon, not in defense of free expression, because there's huge amounts of free expression violations that those people don't care about or even endorse, including lots of ones aimed at Muslims by Western governments, but is really about just saying, look, here's somebody who was doing cartoons about Muslims, provocative, offensive cartoons on purpose, and they got killed by radical Islam or by radical Muslims, and this kind of bolsters our sense of the world. And I just think it's exploitative and very selective, and not about free expression, but about these other agendas.
Yeah, it's funny. I think this thing right out of the box after Charlie Hebdo. John Chait wrote this thing where I think he basically said, in certain cases, it's not enough to defend the right of free expression. You have to actually embrace the speech. I think he said something either like that or perilously close to that. Now, I think for reasons you've articulated, that is fairly clearly a dubious claim to make. But when you but one problem you have in arguing against it is that when you defy his guidance and say, right in the aftermath of Charlie Hebdo, like, I am not Charlie Hebdo, I do not approve of those cartoons, people just have trouble wrapping their minds around the idea that you're not blaming the cartoonists for the murders, right? They just, it's, there's something in the human mind that makes it hard for people to do that. It's like after a tragedy like that, you've got to take one side or the other and say only good things about one side and only bad things about the other side, or people infer a whole lot that's not true about what you're saying. And I think that's maybe like deeply ingrained in the human mind.
Well, but that was what was so interesting about what happened in Garland, in the Texas thing, right? Like, nobody wants to say a positive word about Pam Geller or Geet Wilders, who's, like, they're both genuinely, like, literal fascists.
Right.
And haters in like the purest sense of that word. And, there people had no trouble with the distinction of saying, I loathe Pam Geller and everything she stands for, but I condemn the people who tried to bring violence to her event. This was not a difficult... Now, maybe it would have been different if she had actually been killed, but I don't think so, actually. Maybe, it would have created some more emotions, positive emotions toward her, sympathy, whatever. But I think people would have had no trouble maintaining this distinction. And yet, in the Charlie Hebdo case, not only did people not maintain that distinction, they demanded that everybody ignore that distinction. As you just said, you weren't allowed to say, if Charlie Hebdo were prosecuted or sued, and of course, if they're killed, I'd be the first person to denounce the murders and to defend them in court and say they have their absolute legal right to say it, but I just don't find their content, whether in and of itself or as it's being represented and kind of interpreted in the West, as being admirable. This is so basic to free speech debates. I mean, if you're not allowed to defend somebody's free speech rights, but on the other hand, critique the content of what they're saying, of their ideas, that's a really pernicious way to try and police discourse. And let me just say one more thing about people like John Chait, who said that, and Ross Duthal had a column more intelligent and more nuanced, but still along the same lines, and so did Matt Yglesias, who also was more nuanced about it, but still in that camp of saying it's not enough to defend Charlie Hebdo's free speech rights, you actually have to, throw parades for them.
I think, by the way, I couldn't tell whether Matt was it being a little ironic or, he was kind of obscure and ambiguous. I'm not sure he belongs in that camp, but anyway, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I think he does, but I agree he did it with a lot more caveats and thoughtfulness than John Chait, which is not surprising. But I think that here's the issue that was bothering me from the beginning and still is bothering me a lot, was that argument, that John Chait argument, says essentially that speech that is provocative and offensive and likely to provoke really serious insult and anger and offense and even violence is speech that shouldn't just be legally protected but should be cherished and celebrated. And it's very easy for John Chait to say that because in this particular case, the people who are being offended and hurt and insulted and angered is a group that he is quite politically averse to, which is Muslims. He's a big defender of Israel. He's not himself a Muslim. None of his work evinces any concern for that group in terms of the oppression that they face. And so I think it's very easy to cheer for offensive speech when it's not you who are being offended, and when in some sense it's your adversaries or even enemies who are being offended. That's always easy to defend free speech in that case. The much harder case is when it's actually you and your belief system and your core, beliefs that are being kind of vandalized and assaulted. And that was why I raised the issue pretty early on of, okay, well, we're all now saying, well, hey, isn't it great when there's this speech that's deliberately provocative and offensive? But that's really easy for us in the West to say it when it's applied to Muslims. But what about if it's speech that is vandalizing Judaism or is just anti-Semitic? That is a lot harder to start celebrating and defending. And I don't believe that very many of any of the people who were taking that John Chait position when it applied to Muslims would have said anything remotely like it when it came to speech against Judaism or anti-Semitism. And I can guarantee you that there'd be almost nobody urging an anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish speaker who offended that they should get an award. And that's the part that's most troubling to me.
Yeah, I mean, of course, at that point, people will say, well, these cartoons weren't comparable to anti-Semitism per se, but I do think it is safe to say that. I mean, in general, I think we basically let ethnic groups define what offends them. In America, it's like there's nothing inherently offensive about the N-word. It's a word, but it's come to be offensive. And we let the group say that offends the hell of us, and we go, okay, especially for a group that's been marginalized, that's the way we do it. We let groups decide. And I think it does seem just totally safe to say to me that if anybody said something, did cartoons that offended as large a fraction of the Jewish population as the fraction of the Muslim population that found the cartoons offensive, I just don't think Penn can claim that they would give them an award, right? I mean,
never, ever.
And I would just like to see them address that. I'd like to see them get in a serious, an actual serious sustained debate about the logic behind awarding that prize. Now,
wait, before we move on, can we I just want to zero in on that for a second, unless you.
No, go ahead.
Like I said, I mean, I'm somebody who has defended free speech as a lawyer and then as a journalist, and usually I typically devote my greatest energies on purpose to defending the speech with which I most disagree, because that's when it's hardest and thus most valuable. And typically, when you defend free speech, what you're doing is you're defending the right of people to express ideas that in that society are the most marginalized and despised, because those are the ideas by definition that are the most vulnerable. And that to me is when free expression is it's at its most noble, at its noblest and sort of most important expression, when you're actually defending ideas that are the ones that make people in that society the angriest. And this is, sort of the subsidiary issue that has bothered me the most about all this is, what is easier in the West than defending people who say bad things about Muslims? The United States has been at war with multiple Muslim organizations for more than a decade. We've bombed and invaded and occupied and otherwise manipulated huge numbers of countries around the world that are predominantly Muslim. Everywhere you turn, Bill Maher has an HBO show where every week he says the most foul things about Muslims that would never be allowed to be said about any other group. It's just so easy for a group like Penn to give an award to somebody who's become known for cartoons that are offensive to Muslims. It's the opposite of controversial or edgy or risky or, defending the most vulnerable. It's actually celebrating attacks on the most vulnerable in a really kind of cheap and exploitive way that's designed to produce huge amounts of admiration in the country in which you're doing it. And it just doesn't seem very compatible with the ethos of celebrating free expression to me.
Yeah, there's one other little point I would make is, in terms of the problem people have kind of distinguishing between the legal repression of speech through the legal system, which is actual censorship, and moral condemnation of speech, it seems to me it isn't just that they're different things. It's that our freedom to morally condemn things is what allows us to provide the legal protection of free speech in a certain sense, right? I mean, it's a form of policing speech. Moral sanction. There can be a consensus that the N-word is bad, and that means that almost nobody says it. And so you can have legal, as a matter of law, it's legal to say it, and you don't have to get the government into the role of punishing people for saying things, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, it is interesting in the Charlie Hebdo case because clearly, you're right. Usually free expression violations come from the state, right? People are prosecuted or they're sued or otherwise legally punished for expressing ideas that have been declared to be prohibited, which, by the way, is very, very common in the West, including in France, where in the wake of Charlie Hebdo, numerous Muslims and others, including a prominent comedian, were rounded up for saying things that the French government had said you're not allowed to say, including suggesting some approval for the Charlie Hebdo attack. Underscoring how selective this has all become. But there, obviously, you can have your free expression threatened and stifled by things other than the state, including by, sort of roaming vigilantes who murder people for expressing ideas that they find offensive. And that is the free expression violation taking place in the Charlie Hebdo case. So there is a free expression value to it, even though it doesn't involve state action. You would agree with that, right?
Yeah. You were mentioning the comparison to anti-Semitic cartoons, and you were saying that those would certainly not be greeted as warmly as the Charlie Hebdo cartoons by the kind of American literary establishment. You did, shortly after Charlie Hebdo, you did a piece that was pretty controversial where you actually posted plainly anti-Semitic cartoons, and then a second series of cartoons by Brazilian cartoonists that were a little more kind of on the edge, and I think in your view, like some of them, critical of Israel, but not anti-Semitic per se. But anyway, all of this got you into a certain amount of hot water, and was greeted with, in some corners, I would say, again, incomprehension. I'm sure you certainly saw people attributing to you motivations you don't feel you had, or views you didn't feel you were expressing, like Glenn Greenwald is advocating, anti-Semitism, for example.
Right.
And there's an interesting, your mode of expression, I think you would agree, is not, you're not like, I don't see you ever being a Secretary of State, for example. Right? It's interesting because I had written a New York Times op-ed right after the Danish cartoon thing that was largely in the spirit, substantively, of what you did after the Charlie Hebdo things. But mine was, New York Times op-ed piece. I'm bending over backwards to make clear what I'm saying, what I'm not saying. And I think I earned virtually no enemies as a result of writing that piece. You wrote this piece, in a pretty in-your-face way, and it's your style. And you did, engender some actual, probably some honest incomprehension, as well as some kind of dishonest mischaracterization of what you were saying. In any event, it's a choice of style that maybe, I'm wondering, have you really made it, or is it just like you? It's just like you're this, and I'm not without my own sarcastic tendencies, but like, is it just that, like, hey, you're this sarcastic street brawler, that's who you are, you haven't asked yourself, does it work? Is it the most productive path, or what? How do you account for your persona?
Well, so, a few things. One is the reaction that article generated was completely predictable. It wasn't like I walked into something and then said, oh my God, people are offended by this and are accusing me of anti-Semitism. That reaction was actually part of what I knew would be provoked and was part of the point. Obviously, like, and you have to distinguish it too. I mean, they're just professional pundits who have made a career out of exploiting, in a really cynical way, accusations of anti-Semitism, who just hurl that label at anybody who they want to politically harm. People like, Jeffrey Goldberg or David Frum, both of whom insinuated that I had like my own secret private collection of anti-Jewish cartoons that I just was waiting for the right day to unleash.
David actually said that. David said that on Blogging Heads in a conversation with me when I was debating this issue with him, and I felt bad that I didn't kind of correct him on that point. Because you said in the piece that you had gone out and gathered them, I think, for the purpose of writing the piece. I believe you said we scoured.
Yeah, I feel like people know who David Frum and Jeffrey Goldberg are, and I didn't feel a need to point it out. Ironically, people like that who throw that term around for fun and for their own selfish purposes have done more to trivialize the concept of anti-Semitism than probably any white supremacist in the world, because people have stopped taking it seriously because they use it for everybody who criticizes Israel or even criticizes them. But But I'll just tell you my thought process behind that piece, which is I remember I was talking to Jeremy Scahill. I think it was like the week, maybe a couple days after the Charlie Hebdo attack. And I was telling him, I said, it's actually shocking to me to watch the discussion, because I've been defending free speech for so long, and it is really bizarre for people just this consensus to have arisen all of a sudden that not only are really provocative, offensive ideas to be defended, which is great, I totally agree with that, but it's actually to be celebrated. We're actually supposed to seek out the most offensive, provocative ideas, especially when aimed at a particular religious group, and encourage more of it. We should, in fact, there was this demand that everybody post the offensive cartoons. And I said I remember saying to Jeremy, this is so manipulative because they don't really believe it. They only like it because it's aimed at Muslims, not because it is what they're saying it is, which is provocative and offensive and aimed at a particular religious group. And so we came up with the idea. We said, what we should do? Let's test the authenticity of their principle. Let's go and find a cartoonist and say, we want you to create anti-Jewish cartoons that are just repugnant and offensive, and in a way that Jews will react to these cartoons the way Muslims react or view the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, find that just as offensive. And we went and we spoke to like 3 or 4 different cartoonists who are pretty provocative and daring. And we called them up and we said, hey, we'd love to commission some anti-Jewish cartoons, and we explained the context, that it was satirical and ironic and designed to make this point, and obviously not genuinely anti-Semitic. And every one of these cartoonists said, essentially, are you fucking crazy? Like, I'm not going to do that. That would forever destroy my career. I can't create anti-Jewish cartoons. And that, for me, essentially proved the point. You have people all over the West creating and publishing and celebrating anti-Muslim cartoons, and yet no one who wants to remain in decent company and have a career would dare get near an anti-Jewish cartoon. And so that was what we really wanted to do to make the point. And so instead, I just searched the internet, found some that were clearly grotesquely anti-Semitic, but then also went to this Brazilian cartoonist who's pretty anti-Israel. And I don't think any of his cartoons are anti-Semitic, but I knew some people would think they were. And I distinguished them and put them up as a way of saying, okay, you keep saying that you love offensive, kind of heretical, blasphemous cartoons aimed at a particular religious group. Well, let's see if you really think that, or if you only like it when it's aimed at Muslims. Here's a bunch aimed not at Muslims, but at Jews. Knowing that the very same people celebrating the anti-Muslim Charlie Hebdo cartoons would react the way that they reacted. And I think that really did underscore the point. And just, as far as like the rhetorical style is concerned, I think that different people respond differently to different kinds of persuasion. So, I read your New York Times op-ed from 2006 this morning after you brought it to my attention, and I thought it was fantastic. I agreed with all of it. I thought it was a really great, rational argument. But to be completely honest, I don't remember ever reading it, even though, I'm someone who's paid attention to these issues for a long time, because it wasn't quite as memorable. It wasn't
edgy enough.
Yeah, and so, you're right. Maybe you didn't provoke as much anger, but maybe you didn't provoke as much debate. And to me, it's sort of the question of, you can write about, for example, innocent people being killed in war, and you can write in words that describe the number of people killed and who they are, or you can show a video of Israeli fighter jets slaughtering 4 young boys in Gaza on a beach, and that's going to be a lot more visceral and make the point in a different way. I try really hard to keep my arguments rational and adhering to logical reasoning, and I don't think I can be accused of being some sort of, flamethrower just for its own sake. Like, I definitely engage in reasoned debate and use facts and evidence, but I do think that sometimes taking someone's face and rubbing it into something they want to avoid is a really necessary way to provoke the kind of debate that otherwise is easily evaded.
Let me ask you this. Did you, when you were writing that piece, I don't know what the editorial process is like at the Intercept. I don't know if you showed pieces stuff to people, but did anybody say, or did you think anyone say afterwards, if you had inserted a to be sure paragraph, even at the bottom, I'm not saying this, I'm not saying this, I'm not saying this, you would have insulated yourself against some of the criticism? A, and B, would that have been almost a bad thing? Because it would have gotten less attention.
No. First of all, so I have this debate with myself all the time. Like, should you as a writer preempt what you believe are bad faith attacks by going out of your way to say, I just want to be clear, I'm not saying this, and I'm not saying this, and I'm not saying this? Like, isn't just not saying it sufficient to insulate yourself from the attack that you are? And I've done it both ways before. I remember I wrote once about how Ron Paul ironically has more views consistent with what liberals say they believe in on a whole variety of foreign policy and civil liberty and penal and drug law questions than most mainstream Democrats. And I wrote, before I got into it, I wrote like a 700-word preface saying, listen up, anybody who wants to say that I'm endorsing Ron Paul in this column, I'm absolutely not. That is not the purpose of this. I can understand how progressives wouldn't vote for him. I'm just making these points. And to this day, I still get, oh, remember when you endorsed Ron Paul? So I don't think that those kinds of caveats are effective. I still think David Frum and Jeffrey Goldberg would have disgustingly insinuated that I posted those cartoons because I have my own secret stash, because I actually do harbor hatred for Jews, because that's just how they are. And I don't think a to be sure paragraph would have insulated me. And I just think it's very defensive writing. I think you have the right to rely on readers being smart and well-reasoned to see what you are saying and what you're not.
Okay. Speaking of David Frum and Jeffrey Goldberg and your characterization of them, another thing you have a tendency to do is attribute conscious malign motivations to people, which, strictly speaking, you don't have killer evidence for, right? It could be that David Frum genuinely thought that your column meant what it meant. Now, my instinct is always to do the exact same thing and attribute malign conscious motivation to my adversaries. But as an intellectual matter, I do try to be mindful of the role of the unconscious and how really deep-seated bias is. And people do read, everything is a Rorschach test for people. And so I'm wondering, and this, of course, has gotten you into, has created a certain amount of probably social tension in your life, and is also, it's part of your whole thing, which definitely works. But is that something you think about?
Definitely. And, I tried to distinguish in my answer, people who were genuinely offended by those cartoons and genuinely suspicious of my motives, and sort of the propagandists who just routinely exploit that as part of their careers. I totally acknowledge that it's very difficult, bordering on impossible. It's certainly impossible to prove somebody else's motives, to prove it with mathematical evidence. And it's even difficult to discern their motives. I think it's very difficult to discern our own motives, let alone other people's motives. And we usually have many mixed motives, and it's very rarely, reducible to one sort of simple headline about motives. And that includes pretty much everybody. Virtually nobody is either pure good or pure evil. But, at the same time, I do think that there is this problem that we have in our political culture generally. We very readily and very easily ascribe terrible motives to foreigners or people who are adverse to the United States. I mean, you can pick up a David Frum or Jeffrey Goldberg column on any given day and read all sorts of claims about the motives of Hamas leaders or Iranian mullahs or, anyone like that. And nobody ever says, oh, it's really unfair of you to attribute bad motives to them. That's just sort of accepted. I think that people who have a history in the United States of advocating really evil things, like the Iraq War, like a torture regime, like the ongoing Israeli occupation, not everybody is entitled to be treated, as though they deserve respect, because not everybody is deserving of respect. And so I recognize that my views about somebody else's motives are not provable and not definite, but I think somebody who has a long history over the course of many years of engaging in consistent patterns of behavior, I don't think we should have the obligation to avoid pointing that out of politeness or out of some, kind of contrived notion of civility. I try really hard to search out the people who are critics of mine and who disagree with me, for whom I do have respect, and who I do think are engaged in good faith disagreements. And there are a lot of them, and I find them every day. But I don't think that's true of everybody, and I don't think we should avoid pointing it out when we think we see those patterns.
Okay, now leave aside the question of whether these people are advocating evil things and so on. I mean, that's all your characterization. But I think one thing is kind of hard to argue is that, like, the Iraq War didn't work out well, and so a kind of puzzling thing to me is how. By pretty much everyone's agreement, it just didn't. It's manifestly been a disaster. It seems to me. ISIS probably would not exist without it, and so on. So leave aside the moral motivation.
And like all the hundreds of thousands of people who were killed.
Oh yeah, it's just been a complete disaster that could have, I think, global bad consequences for decades to come. I think, and domestically, this whole Texas shooting thing probably wouldn't have happened if we hadn't fanned the flames at that particular point, although that's very conjectural. But my question is, like, how have the neocons, if anything, increased their influence and their centrality to the debate? I mean, virtually every Republican candidate is totally neocon. Even Rand Paul has kind of chickened out on foreign policy.
Oh yeah,
he's totally looking for Sheldon Adelson's approval. I mean, this is not.
And Hillary is pretty neoconish herself.
Oh, I know. Yeah. I mean, there's talk about Bob Kagan being, like, God forbid, her Secretary of State or something. I mean, I actually have respect for him. I wouldn't lump him with some other neocons, but he's a neocon. I mean, and so how do you have a theory?
I have two, actually. So one is that I just think in general we have no accountability in our elite class, which certainly includes politically influential people and definitely includes journalists. I mean, not to keep using him as an example, and there are plenty of others. But if you go for me, I think if you look at the lead up to the Iraq War, you have to distinguish between the people who had actual responsibility to investigate and make sure they weren't propagandizing, which were politicians and journalists primarily, and think tank people. And then just like the general population that doesn't pay much close attention to politics and sort of relies on these institutions to do that for them. Of the people in that lead up to the Iraq War who were just the hardcore propagandists who said things that were just turned out to be completely deceitful and wrong, Jeffrey Goldberg is very near the head of that list. I mean, if you go and read his New Yorker articles in 2002 and 2003 about Saddam's weapons stockpile and his alliance with Al-Qaeda and all that, it's shocking to read. Not only did he suffer no political repercussions from that, he was showered with gifts by the magazine where you've written for a long time, The Atlantic, in order to leave the New Yorker and come and work there. If you now look at the Iran debate on Sunday morning TV, he's by far the most prominent pundit to whom people like Bob Schaefer turn for expert analysis. So a lot of it is just once you occupy these positions where you're deemed to be respectable and important and knowledgeable, you can never, ever lose it. Unless you go so far and you're scapegoated like Judy Miller. But that's, sort of the exception that proves the rule. So, neocons, they're immune like American elites are immune from accountability. And I think that's part of why they haven't suffered. But the other part of it is the message that they have, the sort of worldview that they propagate, is one that is very appealing, I think, as a matter of human nature, but then also specific American political culture, which is this sort of, tribalism and this jingoism. It's sort of always saying, we are the ones who are morally superior. We are the ones who are peaceful and good. It's sort of like the Charlie Hebdo narrative. And there are these bad, evil people who are threatening us, who instead of being weak with them or waiting for them to attack us, we should go and smash. And this is, this mindset can be viewed as the way it should be, which is sort of primitive and militaristic and violent and destructive and imperial. But in our political culture, it's viewed as being resolute and Churchillian and strong and in defense of important principles. And no matter how many times it's proven to be both morally and strategically disastrous, it still just has appeal given what American mythology is. And I think that's a big part of why they have a huge built-in advantage. And then I guess the final thing I want to say, just one more point about neocons, is the agenda that they advocate, war, building up defense spending, that sort of thing, is one that benefits a lot of really powerful factions that run Washington, that sort of interact in lots of different ways with the elite media. And I think there's kind of a strategic appeal as well. This sort of, let's stand by Israel. Let's, be by far the biggest military spender in the world. Let's go to war like the way other people change their underwear. That benefits a lot of people in really tangible ways who wield lots of power. And I think that's another reason why they don't end up being ejected from the sort of halls of influence, because the people who monitor those halls of influence benefit from and agree with that agenda.
Okay. By the way, I think the unique genius of Jeffrey Goldberg is he's not even considered a neocon. I mean, whereas I think, to the astute reader, much of what he's doing kind of aids and abets the neocons, but he's kind of thought of as this liberal. He's thought of as this liberal guy.
Yeah, I mean, he was a prison guard in, the Israeli prison system holding Palestinians, albeit when he was younger.
Yeah, I do think, we all do crazy things.
I'm just saying, if that were all there were, I wouldn't hold it against him. I'm just saying it's not like that's some unrecognizable Jeffrey Goldberg from the past. I mean, the sort of progression has been very much along those same lines. And yeah, he gives lip service to some kind of centrist liberal principles on social issues and the like. But most neocons aren't very interested in social issues. But when it comes to things like support for Israel and the American role in the Middle East and military spending, I mean, I do think that overwhelmingly he's very consistent with the neoconservative agenda. Yeah.
And I mean, I should say, it's not like he would say it was a crazy thing. I shouldn't say it was a crazy thing to be a prison guard. I can, the world needs prison guards, I guess. But anyway, my point is, it's not one of those things where he would say, "Oh, that was my crazy youth." I mean, that's
what I mean.
He was in the Israeli military, as a number of people have been.
He was an American citizen who went to Israel to join the Israeli military and be.
It was a choice.
Right, and I'm totally in favor of forgiving people's youthful mistakes, and even I'm totally in favor of letting people change their minds about things and not holding it against them forever, or even for a long time. I think that's actually to be encouraged, but I don't think he views that as a shameful, act in his past. And I only mention it because I do think it's consistent with his sort of worldview.
Yeah, no, it's you can infer from that he was, at least at that point, a pretty enthusiastic Zionist, which of course isn't the same as being a neocon, but and I don't know whether he chose whether to be a prison guard or some other role in the army. And I kind of try to bend over backwards, having condemned him, to qualify my condemnation, because he and I have a certain history of bitter personal dispute. So I certainly don't mean to say anything unflattering about him.
No, that would be wrong.
That would be wrong, and I would not do that. So, final question, kind of on this point. The older I've gotten, the more I've realized, the establishment is for real. We used to, when I was young, people talk about the establishment. It's actually for real. and the thing is, you realize that it has this mechanism of constraint, which is that there are certain things you're not supposed to say if you want to remain a member in good standing of the establishment. So you do run the risk of surrendering influence if you say certain things. And I'm not even saying that's inherently bad. I mean, societies need to congeal and have a certain kind of order. There's always going to be an establishment. But what's interesting to me about you is that you really push some of the boundaries, and yet you haven't been thoroughly expelled from the establishment. I mean, an example is the question you've raised about the use of the word terrorist. And, other people have said, well, one man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter, and your point is that's actually true. I mean, and from a global perspective, it would not be so easy to distinguish between the people we call freedom fighters and the people we call terrorists if you were like God and didn't have an American point of view. Perfectly coherent argument, but when you say things like that, you're really starting to mess with the code, of the establishment. Yeah. And yet, I first of all, do you consider yourself a member in good standing of the establishment? You remain influential. You're asked to go on respectable, media. I heard you were going to be on NPR this morning, on the Brian Lehrer show in New York, and so on. What is your view of what space you occupy?
I mean, it's interesting because before someone named Edward Snowden entered my life, I was working on this book about Noam Chomsky and the way in which he had been systematically excluded from mainstream American political discourse, and trying and using that just kind of as an example or an illustration, like a window into understanding how the American media and the institutions that own and control it do really rigidly control the range of debate that can be heard. Even though we like to tell ourselves we have a free press. And you can turn on MSNBC or Fox News and hear two people arguing, one Democrat and one Republican, and say, oh my God, there's arguments everywhere, we must have a free press, when in reality, huge amounts of viewpoints that are held by large numbers of people around the world are never heard on those shows. And I remember I had this long 2-hour discussion with him at his office at MIT, in which I basically said, I kind of think that legitimate criticism of your career has been that you've allowed yourself to be marginalized in this way that wasn't necessary by just refusing to do sort of very minor compromises that wouldn't be compromises of your intellectual integrity or the things that you believe, but like learn how to talk in sound bites, put on a suit, be a little friendly with like TV producers or people who can put you on TV. Isn't it self-indulgent to take the view that, well, I'm just going to, I'm just going to lose my access to mainstream audiences. And he said he didn't think that was a valid criticism because he thought essentially what you suggested, which is that automatically, as soon as you have certain views, you're instantly expelled from those forums, and because they're designed to make sure that those views aren't heard. And so I've always tried really hard strategically to find that balance between how do you make certain that you don't get marginalized in that way. I mean, you're going to be marginalized to some extent, and I have been. I mean, there are certain shows that would never have me on and certain places that would never put me on. But by and large, I've been able to keep at least one foot into that mainstream establishment realm. But at the same time, not compromise the things that you really think and be able to go around saying, you think the things that the United States government does routinely is classic terrorism, or that we are the ones who are sort of causing a lot of the anti-American violence launched against us for rational reasons, that if someone were constantly bombing us and attacking us, we would want to do violence back to them without losing that access. I think it's really important to try and maintain that balance, but it is true that these structures do exist so that there are certain views that if you express enough, and if you're not really strategic about it, you're just not going to be heard. And there's so many examples of views that are held by hundreds of millions of people around the world that if you go on American television and say, you will not be invited back. And so it is really hard to think about how to navigate that balance, but I think it's so important.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I said at the beginning, I may have said we would try to cover some other subjects that we haven't covered. Did I? I forget if I said that, but I was thinking about talking a little about drone strikes and civil liberties, we have very little time. I think it's safe to say that you and I are both drone strike skeptics at best. And I believe you made the point on Twitter or somewhere like, Obama's apology about killing these last two people was like, arguably could have applied to some other an apology might have been in order sooner, but anyway, that.
Well, I mean, I found more interesting. I found the media reaction. I remember like the whole day or 2 days on Twitter and elsewhere after that was revealed, there were all these journalists who were acting like, oh my God, we've just learned for the first time that drone strikes kill innocent people, and they don't even know who they're killing half the time, if not more than that. And anybody who's followed the drone debate at all over the last 5 or 6 years knows that that's exactly the case, that huge numbers of people they're killing are completely unknown in terms of identity, and there's civilians being killed left and right with our drone strikes. And I thought it was just so striking that the reason why people took notice and had the debate was because in this particular case, the person who was killed, the innocent person, was American and not a non-Westerner. And I think it says some really ugly things about the way we value or don't value non-Western life.
Right. And then on civil liberties, I heard that you were, from the Brian Lehrer promo this morning, that your view is that the presidential campaign may actually be good for civil liberties in the sense that there's somebody in both parties, Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul, who is prepared to make civil liberties an issue, which, notwithstanding Paul's having moved to the right on foreign policy, you think he's going to stick by his guns on this one, on civil liberties?
I mean, I think it's impossible to say Rand Paul will stick to his guns on anything at this point, but I mean, he did say in his announcement speech that on day one he would dismantle the NSA spying program, which presumably meant the domestic spying program. And Bernie Sanders has been pretty aggressive on that issue too. So yeah, I do think it'll at least keep the debate front and center and force these other candidates to answer.
You want to hear my mushy liberal grand theory of civil liberties?
I do.
This is like we are the world. This is like, so the conventional reckoning is that what you hear often is, look, there's a trade-off between security and civil liberties. The freer you are, the more vulnerable you will be. The less spying there is, the more vulnerable you will be to terrorist attack, right? This is a standard thing to think of it as two dimensions, security on one end, civil liberties on the other. I want to throw a third dimension into this, which is hatred. And here's the argument. The take-home is, the less hatred there is in the world, the less you will have to choose between civil liberties and security. Because we're living in an age, unlike 50 years ago, when most of the so-called national security threats we face, which I think are overstated, but anyway, they're not like state actors, by and large. They're these non-state actors, and the reason they exist and do have the power to project violence is because in this technological age, mass hatred does have the ability to coalesce, and, you can have this virtual community, Al-Qaeda, whoever. You can do this. If you can find enough people who hate America around the world, you can deploy violence against them even if you're not a state. So you see where I'm going, right? Like, the less hatred of America there is, the freer we can be without worrying about our security. Is that plausible?
Yeah, I mean, yesterday I put a thing on Twitter. I called it, I said, here is arguably the most under-discussed fact in American political discourse, and linked to this 2014 poll.
Right,
that was a really comprehensive poll from around the world. It wasn't like, it was a really reputable polling agency. I think it was Pew, but if not, it was one like that. And it surveyed, I think, 66 countries, and it asked which country poses the greatest threat to world peace. And the answer, overwhelmingly, the number one answer was not Russia or Iran or North Korea or China, it was the United States. And, one of the things that always amazes me is if you talk about drones or you talk about Guantanamo or spying or indefinite detention, people will always say, well, look, there are all these people who want to do us harm, so we need these policies. And the question never gets asked, why are there all these people in the world who want to do us harm? Why are there so many people who want to bring violence to the United States or kill Americans? And Donald Rumsfeld asked that question in 2004. And he asked the Rand Corporation to do a survey and to answer that question. And they issued this report, which you can Google. It's amazing to read, that was really unequivocal. It said the people in the Muslim world who are anti-American, by and large, do not hate us for our freedoms. They hate us for our policies, specifically ongoing interference in the Muslim world, overthrowing their democratically elected leaders, and steadfast support for Israel. If there were other countries or other groups of people dropping missiles on the United States with drones and killing our children, or taking our citizens and putting them in the middle of an ocean for over a decade in cages with no due process, or invading us or funding coups that overthrew our democratically elected leaders, we would hate the people doing that, and we would want to bring violence to them too. There's always going to be some small group of radicals or extremists who just hate. But they can't really function effectively unless they have large swaths of the population that support them, that protect them, that fund them, that help them. And we play a huge role in why they have that support network. And I absolutely agree with you. And this is the huge irony of the post 9/11 era, is that the very policies justified in the name of stopping terrorism are exactly the policies that most fuel it. And I agree, this is a really false choice.
And justified as defending our freedom, whereas in the long run, by generating hatred of America, they will lead us to make choices that sacrifice freedom, in the name of more kind of short-term security reactiveness. So we agree. Who would have guessed? Well, thank you, Glenn. This has been great.
Yeah, it was a great discussion, Bob. I really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. I hope you'll have time sometime down the road. Or maybe time to even debate one of the many people you've personally insulted in the course of this. We'll see about that.
There's so many options, so pick one and I'll come back on.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
All right.